The quiet morning. The day had started with promise, but as the evening wore on, a subtle shift in the atmosphere crept in. Michelle Lutz and her son Timmy were becoming more and more immersed in the carnival experience. The familiar sounds of clinking games and the carnival barkers shouting over the noise of spinning rides created a perfect backdrop for a carefree evening. But what should have been a joyous night out soon began to spiral into something far darker. By the time they had made their way past the merry-go-round and into the bright lights of the Ferris wheel, Michelle was feeling the weight of the day. She had been working non-stop for weeks, juggling her job, Timmy's school, and the constant pressure of providing a stable life for them both. This carnival trip was supposed to be her reward to Timmy for doing well in school, but it was also an escape for her, a break from the overwhelming demands of single motherhood. As they wandered past the games and into the food stands, the carnival air became more palpable. The sounds, the laughter, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy, everything felt like a familiar comfort. But this was exactly the moment when things began to slip through Michelle's fingers. She had grown momentarily distracted, speaking to a friend she hadn't seen in months, laughing and exchanging pleasantries. Timmy, being his energetic self, darted off to the nearby booths, his small figure swallowed up by the crowd. At first, Michelle didn't think much of it. She knew Timmy well enough to trust that he would come back to her. He was an adventurous child, always darting from one attraction to the next, but she felt safe in the bustling crowds of the fairground, sure that he would stay within earshot. She turned her attention back to the conversation, assuming that when the time came, Timmy would wander back to her, as he always did. But minutes turned into an uncomfortable stretch of silence. Michelle glanced around, scanning the crowd. No sign of Timmy. She excused herself from her conversation and started to move toward the carousel, where she had last seen him. Her eyes darted from one end of the fair to the other, but the bustling crowd seemed to have swallowed him whole. A knot of panic began to form in her chest. Her stomach tightened as the realization began to settle in. Timmy wasn't anywhere near the carousel. She pushed through the crowd, calling his name softly at first, trying to maintain some semblance of calm, though her voice began to quiver as she grew more frantic. "Timmy," she called again, louder this time, with a shaky edge in her tone. No answer. The crowd didn't seem to notice the frantic mother searching for her son. They were too consumed by their own fun, oblivious to the panic that was steadily creeping in on Michelle. Her heart raced as she moved quickly toward the concession stands, hoping he had simply wandered off in search of a snack or a toy. Her eyes swept over every face in the crowd, but none of them belonged to Timmy. She stopped a few vendors and asked if they'd seen a small boy wearing a red t-shirt and a pair of denim shorts. No one had. Desperation clawed at her, and she began walking faster, moving toward the rides and attractions at the far end of the carnival. Her mind was racing through the possibilities. Maybe he'd climbed aboard one of the rides. Maybe he was with someone else. The carnival felt massive now, the brightly colored tents and flashing lights turning into an overwhelming maze that stretched beyond what she could handle. A sense of dread began to seep through her, and Michelle felt as though the whole world was closing in on her. The carnival, once a place of lightheartedness and joy, now felt ominous, suffocating. Each step felt heavier, as though the air around her was thickening with the weight of uncertainty. She asked around. A woman in a yellow apron behind a cotton candy booth hadn't seen Timmy. Neither had the teen working the bumper cars. It was as if Timmy had simply vanished. No one had seen him leave the area. The realization hit Michelle like a brick. Her son was missing. The first few minutes of uncertainty had turned into an hour of panic. Her heart thudded in her chest as her mind jumped to wild conclusions. What if something had happened to him? What if he had been taken? The irrational thoughts were overwhelming, yet they couldn't be ignored. She began asking every person she could, "Have you seen my son?" As the minutes stretched into what felt like endless hours, finally, she approached a police officer on duty at the fairgrounds. "Officer, "I can't find my son," she said, her voice unsteady. The officer, a tall man with a calm demeanor, reassured Michelle that they would look into it. He radioed in for assistance, and soon the search escalated. Michelle stood by as more officers arrived, her anxiety rising with each minute. The carnival staff began to shut down rides, and volunteers poured in, forming search teams to comb through every inch of the fairgrounds. They checked the bathrooms, the parking lot, the food stands, and even the nearby alleyways, but there was no sign of Timmy. As the minutes bled into an hour, then two, the carnival began to empty out. Families left the fairgrounds, some unaware that a child was missing. Others left reluctantly, sensing the ominous atmosphere that had descended upon the event. The authorities continued their search, but with each passing minute, the sense of unease grew. Where was Timmy? By 10 p.m., the situation had taken a more serious turn. The police contacted other law enforcement agencies, bringing in additional officers and search dogs. The word spread quickly throughout the town. The community, which had once been carefree, now felt heavy with fear. Volunteers joined the effort, walking through the streets, checking alleyways, knocking on doors, and asking anyone they could if they had seen anything unusual. As the hours dragged on, the search continued through the night. The searchers combed the woods surrounding the carnival, and helicopters began to circle above. At 2 a.m., the search was called off. The search was massive, but still, no sign of Timmy was found. Exhausted but resolute, Michelle was questioned again. This time, her answers became disjointed. As she relayed her story, her eyes were tired, her voice hoarse, but her words were laced with anxiety. She repeated what she had already said, a simple story about going to buy a soda and turning back to find Timmy missing. But her eyes darted around the room. She looked for reassurance, for an explanation, and yet there was none to be found. It was at that moment that the authorities began to wonder if Michelle was hiding something. The search continued at daybreak. Hundreds of volunteers returned to the scene, determined to find Timmy. Helicopters returned, and search teams scoured the dense woods. But Timmy was nowhere to be found. By midday, it became clear to investigators that something was amiss. Despite the massive search, there were no signs of Timmy. No footprints. No clue. It was as though the boy had vanished into thin air. The authorities had no choice but to call off the search. As Michelle was questioned once again, the authorities began to notice a few things. Her composure during these interviews was unnerving. The lack of emotion, was it grief or something else? It was almost as if she was detached from the situation. Her story was still the same, but as they pressed her for more details, small inconsistencies began to emerge. She couldn't quite recall certain facts, and she stumbled over parts of her narrative. The authorities became suspicious. They knew one thing for certain: Timmy was gone, and they needed answers. But at this moment, they had only more questions. And as Michelle continued to tell her story, the more the investigators began to wonder, could she be the key to this mysterious disappearance? But as the days wore on, cracks began to show. Michelle had been cooperative with the authorities from the beginning, but something about her responses seemed off. Each time she was questioned, her story began to shift. Her inconsistencies were subtle at first, but over time, they became more pronounced. Initially, Michelle had told police that when she went to buy a soda, she had left Timmy by a trailer near the concession stand. She said she turned around, and he was gone. Simple, straightforward. A moment of distraction, and her son was lost. But when investigators pressed her for more details, her account started to change. She spoke of a stranger, a man, she said, who had taken Timmy from the carnival ride and threatened her with harm if she didn't stay away. The more she spoke about this man, the less certain her story seemed. She hesitated. The story seemed to lack depth, as if she hadn't actually witnessed what she was describing. When pressed further, she changed her story again. This time, it wasn't just a man. It was a woman, too. Michelle claimed she had been approached by a woman she knew, a woman named Ellen, who offered to watch Timmy while Michelle went to buy the soda. Michelle said that when she returned, the woman and her companions, 2 men and a young girl, were gone, and so was Timmy. At this point, law enforcement began to grow suspicious. They had no way to verify Michelle's claims. No one else had seen the mysterious woman, Ellen, or the men she described. There were no witnesses who could back up her story. Even more concerning, investigators had learned that Michelle had known Ellen in the past, but Ellen had no known connection to Timmy or any reason to be involved in the child's disappearance. The details were unraveling in front of the investigators' eyes. But Michelle wasn't finished. She called the police again a few days later, this time to offer yet another version of events. Now she claimed that while she had been walking to the concession stand, one of the men had approached her and threatened her with a knife, telling her not to yell or else something might happen to Timmy. The same man, she said, had threatened her son too. But the more Michelle tried to explain her story, the more the inconsistencies grew. Her demeanor during all of these interviews was not what anyone would expect from a mother whose child was missing. She was calm, too calm. She didn't break down in tears or seem particularly distressed. She wasn't frantic, but rather, she seemed like she was rehearsing her answers, as if trying to get the story just right. Michelle's explanations were becoming increasingly erratic. She would start one story, only to abandon it moments later, and provide a completely different version of events. When asked why she had waited so long to tell investigators about the man with the knife or the woman named Ellen, she claimed it was because she was afraid for Timmy's safety and didn't want to risk endangering him further by revealing too much. But something about that explanation didn't sit well with the investigators. For one thing, if Michelle truly feared for Timmy's safety, why had she not mentioned these threats earlier? And why did she insist on telling her story in such a convoluted, ever-changing manner? The detectives began to suspect that Michelle wasn't just trying to protect her son. She might have been hiding something. The investigation shifted. Detectives were no longer just focused on finding Timmy. They were beginning to zero in on Michelle herself. In their minds, the shift in her story wasn't just a result of confusion or grief. It seemed deliberate. The authorities knew that a mother's grief, especially when faced with the disappearance of a young child, would normally be raw, immediate, and visible. But Michelle's responses lacked the emotional depth that would be expected from a mother in her situation. Detectives began to look into Michelle's past, searching for any clues that could explain her erratic behavior. What they discovered was startling. Michelle had struggled for years with relationships and personal stability. She had dropped out of high school and had a history of relying on others for financial and emotional support. She had 2 serious relationships that ended with her partners expressing that they were not ready to be stepfathers to Timmy. Michelle's own family was often relied upon to help care for Timmy, and while Michelle was well liked by those who knew her, there was a growing sense that she was trying to keep a perfect image. In the year leading up to Timmy's disappearance, Michelle's sister and brother-in-law, who had been her primary source of childcare, moved away to Florida, leaving Michelle to juggle everything on her own. She was often late for work, sometimes bringing Timmy along. By all accounts, Timmy had begun to show signs of neglect at school, frequent tardiness, unexplained absences, and a lack of involvement in school activities. But despite these challenges, Michelle was still seen by many as a devoted mother who would do anything for her son. Yet, something had changed. Michelle's story about the day Timmy disappeared just didn't match the facts that were emerging. When the police began to investigate the carnival workers, they learned that no one had seen Timmy that evening, despite numerous witnesses recalling Michelle's presence. One witness, a young woman who had been chatting with Michelle before the disappearance, stated that she had seen Michelle alone, no child in sight. Another witness, a group of teenage boys, recalled seeing Michelle talking to a man before the carnival closed down, but they didn't remember seeing Timmy with her at all. This started to paint a troubling picture. As Michelle's alibi fell apart, the authorities delved deeper into the investigation, questioning her ex-boyfriends, the carnival workers, and anyone who might have had contact with Michelle that day. Despite all the hours of investigation and the hundreds of interviews, the authorities were still no closer to finding Timmy or understanding what had really happened. Yet, something in the pit of their stomachs told them that Michelle was hiding something far deeper than a momentary lapse in judgment. The next few months would prove pivotal. As the investigation dragged on, more leads came in, none of which amounted to much. It seemed like every time they came close to a breakthrough, they hit another dead end. But then, just as the case was beginning to fade from the headlines, something unexpected happened. A breakthrough that would turn everything upside down. It came from an unlikely source. A teacher who was out exploring the marshlands near Southville. While walking through the woods, he stumbled upon a small sneaker, one that matched the description of Timmy's shoes. The teacher, knowing the boy was missing, immediately took the shoe to the police, who confirmed it was indeed Timmy's. At first, Michelle insisted the shoe didn't look like Timmy's. But as pressure mounted, she changed her tune, and police began to take the discovery more seriously. They returned to the marshland to continue the search, and in a few weeks, they would find something that would lead to an even darker discovery, something that would change everything. The odd behavior. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation into Timmy's disappearance stagnated. Despite their exhaustive efforts, searching nearby woods, combing through local neighborhoods, and conducting interviews, law enforcement had come up empty-handed. The initial frantic search had faded into a waiting game. Yet something nagged at the investigators, something they couldn't shake. Michelle's unsettling lack of grief and the contradictions in her story. At first, Michelle's friends, family, and even strangers rallied behind her. After all, she was a mother, a young woman who had lost her son in a tragic and unexplained way. Her community, the police, and even the media framed the story as one of heartbreaking loss. But as the weeks passed, Michelle's actions began to betray the very narrative she tried so hard to present. Her behavior became the subject of increasing scrutiny. Michelle was frequently seen in public, going about her daily life with a calmness that many found disconcerting. In interviews, she rarely displayed the raw emotion one might expect from a mother whose child had just disappeared. There were no tears, no emotional breakdowns, only carefully measured responses. When asked about her son, Michelle often seemed composed, but there was something almost robotic in her delivery. She didn't seem to be responding with the intensity or urgency one might expect from a mother desperate to find her missing child. At a local press conference, Michelle stood before the gathered reporters, asking for the public's help in finding Timmy. But instead of the emotional outpouring most would expect from someone in her position, Michelle's voice remained steady, her face almost expressionless. When asked why she hadn't cried publicly, she replied curtly, "I don't show emotion in public. I don't think I need to. Why should I do that just because someone expects it?" Her indifference struck a chord with the public. People were starting to question whether she was really grieving the loss of her son, or if there was something else at play. A few weeks into the investigation, Michelle was spotted at a local bar, drinking with friends, laughing and joking as though the tragedy hadn't just occurred. Some eyewitnesses reported that Michelle even appeared to be having a good time. For a mother whose child had been missing for weeks, this behavior was considered highly inappropriate by many. She seemed oddly detached from the reality of her situation. Her calm, emotionless demeanor became more of a topic of conversation than Timmy's actual disappearance. As the media stormed around her, her behavior became a focal point, making it increasingly difficult to separate the mother's grief from the chilling possibility that she might be hiding something. It wasn't just her public demeanor that seemed suspicious. Michelle's private life also seemed full of contradictions. While she presented herself as a concerned mother, people close to her began to question her commitment to Timmy's well-being. Michelle had struggled for years to maintain a stable life. She had faced numerous hardships, including a tumultuous relationship history and a constant juggling act to balance work, child rearing, and personal life. Timmy's school records revealed a troubling pattern: frequent absences and tardiness, an indication that the child might not have been getting the care he needed at home. A neighbor recalled seeing Timmy alone outside their apartment on more than one occasion, playing near a large German Shepherd dog that lived next door. On one particular day, Timmy had been bitten by the dog, requiring 72 stitches on his face. Despite this, Michelle continued to leave him alone with the dog, even after being warned about the danger. This, coupled with other similar incidents, painted a picture of a mother who, while loving, seemed to lack a certain level of responsibility and awareness when it came to Timmy's safety. Meanwhile, Michelle's strained relationships also became a point of interest for investigators. Her ex-boyfriends were interviewed, and they described her as someone who often struggled with the pressure of being a mother. One ex-fiancé, who had dated Michelle for several years before the relationship ended shortly before Timmy's disappearance, shared his concerns. He mentioned that Michelle seemed more like a sister than a partner, and that he had always felt she wasn't ready to be a stepmother to Timmy. He recalled that Michelle had once said she wasn't cut out for motherhood, and he began to question her commitment to Timmy's well-being after the dog bite incident. Despite the growing doubts, the investigators had no concrete evidence linking Michelle to any wrongdoing. They had no witnesses to a crime, no physical evidence, and no clear motive. Michelle's story, as fractured as it was, didn't provide them with a definitive answer. The more they dug, the more elusive the truth seemed. Then came a breakthrough that no one expected, a discovery that would reignite the investigation and shift the focus back onto Michelle. In October 1991, 5 months after Timmy's disappearance, a nature enthusiast and school teacher named Robert Jenkins was exploring the marshlands near Southville's business park. The area was largely undeveloped, full of dense brush and overgrown trees, but Robert had taken a personal interest in the area as part of his environmental studies. As he walked through the marsh, he stumbled upon something unusual: a sneaker. It was a small child's shoe, recognizable by its design. The shoe was dirty and worn, but Robert immediately recognized it as a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle sneaker, the same kind Timmy had been wearing when he went missing. Realizing the potential significance of the discovery, Robert took the shoe to the Southville Police Department. The authorities immediately confirmed it was indeed Timmy's. They dispatched officers to search the area where the shoe had been found. The marshland was scoured, but nothing more was found in the immediate vicinity. When the shoe was shown to Michelle, she was quick to deny that it was Timmy's, insisting that it didn't look like the one he had been wearing that day. Her response seemed odd, especially considering the shoe had been positively identified as Timmy's. But under the mounting pressure, Michelle changed her tune and admitted that the shoe might indeed be her son's, especially after she was shown the box the shoes came in and confirmed that they matched the specifications. This inconsistency raised more red flags. Why had Michelle initially denied the shoe was Timmy's? If she truly believed her son had been abducted, why would she question the shoe's connection to him? Despite Michelle's eventual admission, the investigation continued to grow colder. But then, as the year drew to a close, another surprise discovery surfaced that would further escalate the case. In February 1992, the authorities received an anonymous tip. A man called into the police station, claiming he had information about the identity of Timmy's kidnapper. The caller refused to give his name, but he provided a disturbing description. According to the tipster, Timmy's abduction had been orchestrated by a man with a vendetta against Michelle. He claimed that this man had asked for help in killing both Michelle and her son, and that he had gone to extreme lengths to carry out his revenge. The police, intrigued but cautious, began to investigate further, but there was one glaring issue with the tip. The name of the supposed perpetrator was misspelled. The man in question, who Michelle had once dated, had a criminal history. Despite the seemingly detailed information, investigators began to wonder if the anonymous tip had been planted by Michelle herself. The misspelling of her name, an odd mistake, seemed too deliberate, too convenient. The investigation had taken a dark turn, But despite the mounting evidence of Michelle's suspicious behavior, the authorities still had no direct proof that she had harmed her son. But as time wore on, and Michelle's behavior grew even more erratic, a disturbing conclusion began to take shape in the minds of the investigators. Maybe Michelle knew more than she was letting on. The story was about to take a shocking new direction, one that no one, not even the most seasoned detectives, could have predicted. The unraveling. As months passed with no clear answers, Southville's residents had become increasingly divided over the mystery of Timmy's disappearance. While some still believed Michelle was a grieving mother who had lost her son under tragic, inexplicable circumstances, others began to see her in a different light, one marked by suspicion. The quiet whispers that had once been confined to hushed corners of the community began to spill out into the open, and the doubts about Michelle's involvement were impossible to ignore. Despite the growing uncertainty surrounding Michelle's behavior, the investigation still lacked hard evidence. Police had exhausted nearly every lead, following false tips and analyzing every witness statement. They had searched Timmy's home, her car, and even questioned people in Michelle's inner circle, including her family and ex-partners. Each time they believed they were close to cracking the case, another dead end would emerge. Yet the disturbing patterns in Michelle's actions, the contradictions in her statements, her unyielding calm in the face of her son's disappearance, and the peculiar behavior that continued to surface, pushed investigators to the edge of their patience. But it was an unlikely discovery that would ultimately lead the authorities to a chilling conclusion. In the winter of 1992, after nearly a year of fruitless searching, the investigation took a dramatic turn when a local environmentalist and teacher, Robert Jenkins, found something that would rekindle the investigation. Robert was known for his love of nature, often walking through the marshlands of Southville to take photos and document the local wildlife. On one such walk in February, he discovered something peculiar, a small sneaker buried among the overgrown brush near a marsh. The shoe was immediately recognizable. It was a faded, worn Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle sneaker, one that Michelle had described as belonging to Timmy. Robert brought the shoe to the police, who confirmed it was indeed Timmy's. This discovery was enough to reignite the investigation, but not in the way anyone had hoped. When police showed the shoe to Michelle, her reaction was telling. She first insisted that it wasn't Timmy's, even though she had previously described the exact same type of shoe he had been wearing on the night of his disappearance. There was an eerie hesitation in her response. After further questioning, she admitted that it might indeed be Timmy's, but only after being shown a box of the same shoes that she had bought for him weeks earlier. The authorities were perplexed by Michelle's initial reluctance to acknowledge the connection between the shoe and her son. Why, if she had been so concerned about finding Timmy, had she denied something so obvious? This discrepancy in her behavior, paired with her increasingly bizarre responses to the investigation, began to raise alarm bells. Michelle's reluctance to cooperate fully, combined with her previous inconsistent statements, now seemed more than just a sign of stress. It appeared to be an attempt to manipulate the investigation. Authorities were beginning to think that Michelle might have had more involvement in her son's disappearance than she had let on. By mid-1992, the investigation began to shift from searching for Timmy to searching for answers about Michelle's potential role in his disappearance. It was during this period that Michelle's behavior became even more erratic. She had shown little outward emotion during Timmy's disappearance, but her actions in the months that followed seemed to paint a portrait of a woman whose personal struggles were clouding her ability to connect with her son's case. One of the more disturbing moments in the investigation came when Michelle appeared at a fundraiser organized to help find Timmy. The event had been set up by concerned members of the community, with a goal to raise money for further search efforts. Michelle had been listed as one of the key organizers, and yet, instead of showing gratitude or grief, she seemed strangely disconnected from the entire event. The fundraiser, which had been intended to help find a missing child, featured inappropriate entertainment, Chippendales dancers, and Michelle herself had recommended them, despite the event taking place at Timmy's Catholic school. When the community raised concerns about the dancers being inappropriate for a fundraiser for a missing child, Michelle defended her choice, insisting that it would draw more attention and money for the cause. The entire episode felt out of place, and many people began to question Michelle's motives and emotional state. Rather than channeling the support of the community into finding her son, she seemed to be taking advantage of the situation in ways that appeared self-serving. Michelle also displayed unusual behavior behind the scenes. She became involved in a second fundraiser, which was similarly controversial, involving an event that was not only in poor taste, but also led her to quit the board of the charity after they refused to continue with her suggestions. This behavior left many members of the board confused and deeply uncomfortable. Michelle's aloofness and the controversial nature of her decisions seemed to speak volumes. She was not behaving like someone with a child missing. As these strange events unfolded, law enforcement officials revisited their investigation with renewed vigor. They had been focusing heavily on the events of the night Timmy disappeared. But now, with a clearer understanding of Michelle's behavior and the conflicting reports from witnesses, they started to re-examine the broader context of her life and personal relationships. Detectives began to look deeper into Michelle's past, examining her history of personal relationships, her interactions with family, and her track record as a mother. It soon became clear that Michelle had faced significant difficulties in her personal life. Her tumultuous relationship history, her failure to maintain steady employment, and her history of relying on others for support. But even more telling were the accounts of people close to Michelle. One ex-fiancé, who had been in a relationship with Michelle for several years, recalled a time when Timmy had been severely bitten by a neighbor's dog. The child required 72 stitches to his face after the attack, but Michelle, despite warnings, continued to leave Timmy alone with the dog. This incident painted a troubling picture. A mother who was perhaps neglectful of her son's safety, or at the very least, unwilling to listen to warnings about the dangers around him. Additionally, Michelle's comments to various people close to her were revealing. She often spoke of feeling overwhelmed by motherhood, once remarking to a friend that she didn't think she was cut out for being a mom. Another acquaintance recalled Michelle saying she was a weekend mother and not built for the everyday challenges of raising a child. These comments would take on new meaning in light of what was about to come. As investigators dug deeper into Michelle's past, they discovered something even more disturbing: a connection to the area where Timmy's remains would eventually be found. Michelle had worked in an office park near the marshlands, and investigators learned that the area had been under her radar all along. She had failed to mention this connection during her initial interviews. It wasn't until months later that this key detail emerged, and it made law enforcement question if Michelle had known exactly where Timmy's body would eventually be discovered. It was a detail like this that began to turn the case around. Investigators now had a clearer understanding of Michelle's potential motives, and they began to build a case based on circumstantial evidence, particularly the disturbing clues that suggested she had been hiding something all along. As investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the story, one final piece of evidence would send shockwaves through the community and seal Michelle's fate. A tip from a concerned member of the community led the police to a secretive piece of information that would unravel the entire investigation.